The house greeted me with silence. I hesitated on the front porch, my hand trembling on the brass doorknob. The wind whispered through the trees behind me, the chill biting at my neck, but the cold wasn't what made me shiver. It was the weight of the past pressing against my chest. This place, our place, stood exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time. The door creaked open, and the scent of aged wood and old books enveloped me. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my feet like they were remembering me too. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtains, casting long, dusty shadows across the entryway. Everything felt hollow, like the house knew Emily was gone and blamed me for it. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, taking in the details. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked faintly, its hands still moving, even though everything else seemed to have stopped. The walls were lined with faded photographs, memories trapped in frames. Emily and I on our wedding day, laughing on the porch, standing under the old oak tree in the backyard. Each one stabbed at my heart. I dropped my bag on the floor and rubbed my eyes. I didn't know why I'd come back. Maybe I thought returning here would help me understand, help me cope with the emptiness that had followed me since the accident. But standing in the dim light of the house we had planned to grow old in, all I felt was regret. I wandered through the living room, my fingers brushing against the furniture as if trying to prove it was real. The coffee table still bore the faint stain of red wine from the night we celebrated her promotion. The armchair by the window was indented just how she liked it. The silence pressed down on me, each room a museum of a life that had ended too soon. My eyes landed on the old mirror above the fireplace. It was large, ornate, with a gilded frame that curled in on itself like vines choking a tree. My reflection stared back, hollow-eyed, gaunt, a man who hadn't slept in days. My beard was scruffy, and my clothes hung off me. I barely recognized myself. I sighed and looked away. The mirror made the room feel colder, emptier. This was a mistake, I thought. Coming back here had been a terrible idea. But where else could I go? The world outside this house felt too loud, too fast, like it had moved on while I was stuck in place. Dragging my feet, I climbed the staircase, the steps creaking with every hesitant move. The hallway upstairs was dimmer, the late afternoon light barely reaching the old wallpaper. I passed the door to what used to be our bedroom. The thought of going in there made my stomach turn. Instead, I pushed open the door to the guest room. It was simpler, less steeped in memory. A bed, a small desk, a window overlooking the overgrown garden. I tossed my bag onto the bed and sat down, my head in my hands. For a moment, the house was silent again. Just the tick of the clock downstairs, the soft rustling of leaves outside. My mind drifted back to that night. The rain on the windshield, the glare of headlights, Emily's scream. I clenched my fists, trying to push the memory back down. But I couldn't escape it. Not here, not anywhere. I stood up and faced the small mirror above the dresser. My reflection stared back, empty and defeated. I turned away, unable to look at myself any longer. The fatigue was overwhelming. Maybe if I slept, I'd wake up feeling less like a ghost. I lay down on the bed, the springs groaning beneath me. The light outside faded slowly, shadows stretching across the ceiling. I closed my eyes, the silence swallowing me whole. But just before sleep claimed me, a faint sound echoed from somewhere in the house, like a whisper or a breath. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice rough and uncertain. Nothing, just the creaking of the old house. I shook my head. It's just the wind, I told myself, or maybe the house settling. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house had shifted, like the walls were listening, like the shadows were deeper than they should be. And somewhere, just out of sight, the mirror waited. The night wrapped the house in darkness, and I woke with a start. My heart thudded in my chest as I sat up, disoriented. The clock on the wall read 3:14 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly. The air in the room felt cold and stale, pressing against my skin like a damp cloth. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. The floorboards were icy beneath my feet. I tried to steady my breath. It's just the house, I thought. Old wood and colder nights. But then I heard it again. A faint whisper, just on the edge of perception, like the sound of someone exhaling through gritted teeth. It came from the hallway. I stood up, my body tense. The house was supposed to be empty. It was just me. I told myself it was probably my imagination, the remnants of a bad dream clinging to the edges of reality. But the whisper came again, just a little louder, a little closer. I reached for the door and hesitated. My hand trembled on the knob. I took a breath and turned it slowly, the latch clicking as the door creaked open. The hallway was draped in shadows. Moonlight filtered through the window at the end of the corridor, casting pale, ghostly beams across the floor. The air was colder out here, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I stepped forward. The whisper had stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something, or for something to find me. I passed by the closed door of our old bedroom, the memory of Emily's laugh so sharp in my mind that it felt like a physical blow. I clenched my jaw and moved on, my eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Then I saw it, the mirror in the hallway, the one that hung across from the staircase. It seemed larger now, its frame twisting in the dim light, the gold tarnished and dull. My reflection was there, but something was wrong. The figure in the glass was standing too still, the eyes too wide, too aware. I swallowed hard and took a step closer. My reflection copied me, but just a beat too late. I blinked, and my reflection blinked, slowly, deliberately. A sick chill crawled up my spine. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The figure in the mirror smiled. I did not. My breath caught in my throat. The smile was thin and wrong, curling up at the edges like paper set aflame. My reflection's eyes gleamed with something that wasn't mine, something cold and malicious. I stumbled back, my shoulder bumping against the wall. The figure's smile faded, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying me. A flicker of anger flashed across its face before it returned to blank neutrality. I rubbed my eyes. "You're exhausted. It's just your mind playing tricks." But when I looked again, the figure in the mirror was still watching, still waiting. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I turned away, my legs unsteady, and stumbled back toward the guest room. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, my chest heaving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning came sluggishly, the light seeping through the curtains like it didn't want to enter the house. I spent most of the day trying to shake off the memory of the mirror, convincing myself it had been a product of exhaustion and grief. But the unease clung to me, sticky and inescapable. By evening, I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I wandered through the house, trying to busy myself. I cleaned the kitchen, sorted through old papers, rearranged furniture, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every time I passed a mirror, I felt eyes on me. I avoided looking directly, afraid of what I might see. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself back in the living room. The large mirror above the fireplace loomed like a dark window. I kept my gaze on the floor, the air heavy with an unspoken dread. But something drew my eyes upward, a pull gentle but irresistible. I looked into the mirror, and I saw it. My reflection stood there, just as before, but now it leaned forward ever so slightly. Its eyes locked onto mine. The glass seemed thinner, as if the barrier between us had worn away. My reflection's chest rose and fell with measured breaths. Its lips curled up in that same terrible smile. Then slowly it lifted a hand. I felt my own arm twitch, a sharp pain shooting through my shoulder, but I didn't move my hand. My reflection did. It pressed its palm against the inside of the glass, fingers splayed. I stared, my mouth dry, my heart a wild drumbeat in my chest. The figure's eyes narrowed, and its lips moved. The words didn't carry through the glass, but I understood them. "Let me out!" A jolt of terror shot through me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The crash echoed through the house, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, hand on the glass, eyes boring into mine. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the guest room. The door locked, my back pressed against it. My breaths came in ragged gasps. I couldn't deny it anymore. The thing in the mirror wasn't just a trick of the light or my exhausted mind. It was real, and it wanted my place. I don't know how long I sat there, my back against the door, my knees drawn to my chest. The world outside the guest room felt distant, unreal. My mind kept replaying the image of my reflection, the cold smile, the fingers pressed against the glass, the whispered plea, "Let me out." The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing closer, suffocating me. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Whatever was in that mirror wouldn't just go away. It was waiting, and it was getting stronger. I had to end this. With trembling hands, I grabbed the old flashlight from the nightstand and pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark now, the moonlight spilling pale silver across the floor. The air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I walked toward the living room, each step an act of willpower. The flashlight beam cut through the shadows, but it felt weak, barely holding back the darkness. My breath echoed in the silence. As I entered the living room, the large mirror above the fireplace loomed before me. The gilded frame seemed to twist and curl, as if alive. My reflection stood there, waiting, its face a blank mask of anticipation. I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure's lips curled into that familiar, cruel smile. It raised a finger and pointed at me. "You know what I want." The words weren't spoken aloud, but I felt them inside my head, cold and sharp. "You want my life," I said, my throat dry. "You want to take my place." The reflection nodded slowly, the motion unnervingly fluid. A surge of anger flared within me, cutting through the fear. "You can't have it." The reflection's smile faded, its eyes narrowing. The air grew colder, and a low vibration seemed to hum through the walls. "You have no choice." The room shuddered. The glass of the mirror rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The figure leaned forward, its hands pressing against the inside of the glass, pushing, straining. Cracks spread from its fingertips, spiderwebbing across the surface. I staggered back, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The cracks grew wider, the glass splintering with an eerie melodic sound, like a distant choir singing out of tune. "It's breaking through." I had to stop it. But how? My mind raced. The Maldição, the reflection, the guilt, it all came back to that night. The night Emily died. The memory burned in my brain. The rain, the argument, my hands gripping the wheel too tight, the tires skidding. It was my fault. My knees buckled. The guilt was a weight that threatened to drown me, to pull me under, and that was what it wanted. My reflection fed on that guilt, on my weakness. It was stronger because I let it be. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. "No," I whispered. "I won't let you." The figure's eyes widened, a flicker of doubt crossing its face. I took a step forward, my voice shaking but growing stronger. "You're just a piece of me, the part I want to forget, the part I've been running from." The reflection's hands faltered, the cracks in the glass pulsing like veins. The rippling slowed. "I made a mistake," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "Emily's gone because of me, and I have to live with that. But you're not my punishment. You're my prison." The figure's face twisted in fury. It pounded against the glass, but the cracks began to close, the fractures knitting together. The more I spoke, the weaker it seemed to become. "I won't let you take my life," I said. "I'm done hiding. I'm done running. You can't control me anymore." A scream tore from the reflection, a soundless wail of rage and despair. Its form flickered, its edges blurring, the smile crumbling into a snarl. The glass began to heal, the lines vanishing one by one. I stepped closer, my face inches from the mirror. "You're not me." The figure's eyes widened in shock. Its mouth opened in a final silent scream. Then, with a sound like shattering ice, the reflection imploded, fragments of shadow collapsing inward until nothing was left. The mirror's surface went still, clear and smooth. My reflection stared back at me, just me, hollow-eyed, exhausted, but real, whole. I took a shaky breath, my chest heaving. The cold in the room lifted, replaced by a strange, fragile warmth. It was over. The dawn light crept through the windows, painting the walls in soft gold. I sat on the porch steps, the cool morning air brushing against my face. The weight in my chest was still there, but it felt lighter, as if the shadows had finally loosened their grip. I looked back at the house, the old familiar walls, the cracked paint, the memories woven into every beam. It was still haunted, but not by the reflection. The only ghosts left were the ones I carried inside me. I stood up and walked down the path, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, full of possibilities I hadn't dared to consider until now. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to find out. The town of Havenwood was shrouded in a perpetual mist, the kind that clung to the edges of your vision like a half-forgotten memory. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the narrow streets lined with old Victorian houses. They loomed like forgotten sentinels, their faded paint and cracked shutters whispering of better days. The sun struggled to pierce through the dense fog, casting everything in a gray, muted light. The sign at the edge of town read, "Welcome to Havenwood, population 3,742. It felt smaller than that, almost too small to hold all the secrets the shadows seemed to hide. I sighed, my breath fogging up the windshield. The ache in my chest flared, a familiar, unwelcome companion. This move was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to bury the memories that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But as I drove past the old brick buildings and the narrow, tree-lined roads, I wondered if I'd simply traded one haunting for another. I turned onto Moss Lane, a winding street that led up a small hill. My new house sat at the end, a modest two-story building with dark green siding and white trim. The realtor had called it cozy. I called it a place to hide. The engine sputtered as I killed the ignition, and for a moment I sat in the silence, the weight of my decision settling over me like a heavy quilt. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was sharp, carrying a faint smell of pine and damp earth. A chill ran through me, but it wasn't the cold. It was the sense that I didn't belong here, that the town knew it too. The wooden steps creaked as I climbed the porch. The key felt heavy in my hand, like it didn't want to fit in the lock. But the door swung open easily enough, and I stepped inside. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if it were listening. I let my bag slip off my shoulder and glanced around the living room. The hardwood floors were scratched and scuffed, but the place was clean. A worn-out sofa faced a brick fireplace, and bookshelves lined the walls, empty and waiting. The windows were tall and narrow, filtering in pale light that did little to warm the space. Shadows pooled in the corners, just out of reach. I walked through the house slowly, my footsteps echoing on the floorboards. The kitchen was small, with chipped tiles and cabinets that smelled faintly of varnish. The upstairs hallway was lined with closed doors, each one leading to a room I hadn't yet explored. I stopped at the door to what would be my bedroom. The knob was cold under my palm. When I pushed it open, the room greeted me with a wave of emptiness. A bed, a dresser, a nightstand. The walls were bare, the windows covered with thin white curtains that fluttered slightly, though no breeze stirred. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence pressed in again, wrapping around me. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was back in my old home. I could hear Caleb's laughter echoing down the hall, feel the warmth of his small hand in mine. But then the memory turned dark. Screeching tires, shattered glass, the scream that lodged in my throat and never came out. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, the ache in my chest sharp and familiar. Enough, I whispered to myself. This was why I came here, to escape the memories, to start over. I rubbed my face with my hands, trying to shake off the heaviness. I needed to focus. I had a new job, a new life. I was here to help people, not drown in my own grief. The next morning I arrived at the Havenwood Psychiatric Clinic. The building was a converted mansion, its walls lined with ivy that seemed to grip the stone like desperate fingers. Inside, the air was cool, the scent of antiseptic barely masking something older, something musty. The receptionist, a young woman named Claire, greeted me with a tight smile. "Welcome, Dr. White," she said, handing me a stack of patient files. "Your first appointment is in 15 minutes. "Thank you." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I walked down the corridor, my shoes clicking against the tile floor. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of stern-looking men and women, their eyes following me as I passed. I reached my office and pushed open the door. The room was simple: a desk, 2 chairs, a clock ticking softly on the wall. The window overlooked the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and still, their trunks disappearing into the mist. I sat at the desk, flipping open the first file. Nathan Carter, age 12. Nightmares, anxiety, fear of the dark. I frowned. The next file was similar. Maggie Foster, age 15. Insomnia, recurring dreams of a shadowy figure. The third, fourth, and fifth files all described the same thing: vivid nightmares, an overwhelming sense of dread, and whispers that followed them even after they woke. A chill prickled the back of my neck. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," I said, clearing my throat. The door opened slowly, and a boy with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes stepped inside. Nathan Carter. He looked at me with a hollow gaze that seemed far too old for his small frame. "Hello, Nathan," I said softly. "I'm Dr. White." He didn't respond. He just looked past me out the window, his lips trembling. "Do you want to sit down?" I gestured to the chair across from me. He finally looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "It knows you're here now." I blinked, my pulse quickening. "What knows?" "The thing from my dreams," he said, his eyes glassy. "The one that whispers." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Don't listen to it," he whispered. "It lies." I swallowed, my throat dry. "What does it say, Nathan?" His gaze drifted to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to deepen. "It says it can bring people back." Nathan's words echoed in my mind. a cold whisper that clung to my thoughts long after he left the room. "It says it can bring people back." I leaned back in my chair, my hands shaking slightly. I tried to steady my breath, to ground myself in the reality of my office, the ticking clock, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, but the shadows in the corners felt darker now, and the chill in the air seemed to seep into my bones. It was just a child's nightmare, I told myself, a manifestation of fear, of unresolved trauma, and yet, that gnawing sense of dread wouldn't leave me. The look in Nathan's eyes wasn't the look of a child imagining monsters. It was the look of someone who had seen something real, something he couldn't escape. I stood up abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the forest loomed, the bare branches of the trees reaching up like skeletal fingers. The mist clung to the trunks, thick and opaque, as if hiding something just beyond sight. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the chill. My eyes drifted to the edge of the woods, and I swore I saw a figure standing just at the tree line. Tall, cloaked in shadow, featureless, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I pressed my hands to my temples and took a deep breath. "You're exhausted," I thought. "It's just your mind playing tricks." But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Over the next few days, the sessions blurred together, a parade of pale faces and hollow eyes. Maggie Foster, Eli Bennett, Sarah Whitman, each of them described the same nightmare, a dark figure, whispering promises and threats. The details varied, but the core was always the same. The figure knew their fears, their secrets, and it offered them something they desperately wanted: peace, relief, for some even the return of lost loved ones. Every time I listened, a knot tightened in my stomach. Their words felt too familiar, too close to my own grief. The guilt I carried for Caleb's death was a weight I bore every day, and as I listened to my patients, the whisper of my own guilt grew louder. Each night, sleep became harder to find. When I did manage to drift off, I found myself in a cold, gray place, a void where the air was thick and heavy. In the distance, I would hear the faintest of whispers, like wind through dead leaves. "He doesn't have to be gone forever." I woke drenched in sweat, the darkness of my room pressing down on me, the shadows lingering just a second too long before fading back into the corners. I told myself it was just stress, that I was absorbing too much from my patients, that my own trauma was bleeding into my work. But then the whispers followed me into the daylight. It started subtly. At first I thought it was the wind, a soft, barely audible sound that drifted through the clinic halls, just out of reach. But soon I began hearing it in my office. While taking notes, I'd hear a word, a phrase, threading through the silence. Guilt. Failure. Come back. I'd snap my head up, searching the empty room, my pulse roaring in my ears. But there was never anything there. One afternoon, as I was reviewing Maggie Foster's case file, the whisper grew louder. "Evelyn." My pen dropped to the desk, my hand frozen mid-note, my breath hitched. The voice was unmistakable. It was Caleb. The sound was faint, distant, as if carried from miles away, but it was him, his small, soft voice laced with that innocent curiosity that I would never hear again. "Caleb?" I whispered before I could stop myself, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer now. "Mom, I'm here." Tears stung my eyes. My hands gripped the edges of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "Where?" My voice was a fragile breath. "Where are you?" The shadows in the corner of the room thickened, coiling and twisting like ink dropped in water. The temperature plummeted, a cold so sharp it felt like needles against my skin. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was cloaked in darkness, its form shifting and indistinct. But in the center of that void, a pair of eyes gleamed, cold, empty, and knowing. The whispers coiled around me, tightening like a noose. "I can bring him back, Evelyn." The voice was wrong. It carried Caleb's tone, but it was warped, twisted with a cruel edge that made my skin crawl. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my limbs frozen. I wanted to run, to scream, but the promise held me in place. "Bring Caleb back." The figure took another step forward, the shadows peeling away like dead skin. The air grew dense, suffocating. I felt myself leaning in, drawn toward the cold, endless void that radiated from it. "All you have to do is let me in." The whispers filled my head, growing louder, sharper. They clawed at my mind, each word a barbed hook sinking deeper. "I can bring him back. You don't have to be alone. It was your fault." The figure's hand stretched out, long fingers made of darkness reaching for me. A sick dread churned in my gut, but beneath it, hope flickered. A dangerous, desperate hope. My vision blurred with tears. The weight of my guilt pressed down on me, and for one terrible moment, I considered saying yes. But then I remembered Nathan's hollow eyes, his whispered warning. "Don't listen to it, it lies." With a shuddering breath, I tore my gaze away and slammed my eyes shut. "No," I choked out. "You're not real." A guttural hiss filled the room, a sound of pure rage. The cold deepened, then shattered like glass. The air rushed back, warm and sharp, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The shadows had retreated to the corners, watching but dormant. I collapsed into the chair, my body trembling. Tears streamed down my face as I gasped for breath. It wasn't just a nightmare, it wasn't just my guilt. The thing in the shadows was real, and it knew me, and now it knew I was afraid. I didn't sleep after that night. The whisper lingered in my mind like a splinter under my skin. No amount of logic or self-reassurance could silence it. The entity had shown itself to me. It knew my grief, my guilt, and now it was clawing at the edges of my reality. By morning, a fragile determination settled over me. I couldn't run. I couldn't ignore it. If I didn't face this thing, it would keep feeding on my patience, on me, until there was nothing left. I sat at my desk in the clinic, staring at the case files spread before me. Nathan, Maggie, Eli, Sarah. Their hollow eyes haunted me, mirrors of my own pain. We were all caught in its web, ensnared by whispered promises and half-truths. But it was more than just them. This entity wasn't bound to just nightmares. It was seeping into our lives, twisting reality itself. And it was offering me a choice I could barely resist. Caleb. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling. "I'm so sorry, baby," I whispered to the memory of my son. "But I can't let it win." I knew what I had to do. The forest behind Havenwood was a place of dense shadows and silent decay. Branches twisted together overhead, blotting out the sun. The air was thick, damp, carrying the faint scent of rotting leaves. As I stepped onto the narrow path, a cold dread settled into my bones. I clutched the small bundle in my hands, a handful of sage, a vial of salt water, and a photo of Caleb. They felt pathetically fragile against the weight of what I was facing. But this wasn't about power. It was about resolve. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead leaves under my feet. The mist curled around the trees, thickening with each step, and soon I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Then I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, then louder. A chorus of voices. My patients, their fears, their secrets, all blending together into a dissonant murmur. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, each step dragging me closer to something I couldn't see, but felt looming in the dark. I stepped into a clearing. The ground here was bare, blackened as if scorched. The air was colder, the mist clinging to the ground in thick, writhing tendrils. In the center stood the figure, taller now, more defined, a silhouette made of pure shadow, its edges constantly shifting, like smoke trapped in a bottle. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of cruel light. It smiled, a grotesque mockery of warmth. "You came, Evelyn." My breath caught. It still used his voice, Caleb's voice. The wound in my heart throbbed, fresh and raw. I forced myself to stand tall. "I know what you are." The smile widened, stretching too far. "I'm what you want. I'm what you need, and I can give him back to you." The mist thickened, and for a moment, the shadow figure blurred and shifted. When it solidified again, Caleb stood there. My Caleb. His dark hair fell in messy curls over his forehead, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity and light. He wore his favorite blue sweater, the one with the dinosaur on it. "Mom," he said, his voice small and scared. "Why did you leave me?" A sob tore through my chest. My legs wobbled and I dropped to my knees. "No," I choked out. "You're not him." Tears blurred my vision. My fingers dug into the cold, damp earth. Every cell in my body screamed at me to run to him, to hold him. But deep down, I knew. Caleb was gone. This was a cruel imitation, a weapon wielded by something that wanted to destroy me. The figure's smile twisted into a sneer. Caleb's image flickered, the edges fraying. "You can have him back," the shadow hissed. "You just have to let go. Give yourself to me, and I'll fill that emptiness. No more guilt, no more pain." The whispers swelled, a cacophony of temptation. My head throbbed, my vision darkening. It would be so easy to say yes, to surrender and let the guilt dissolve into nothingness. But then I thought of Nathan, Maggie, Eli, the children whose lives this thing was poisoning. I thought of the clinic, of the fragile hope I'd tried to give them. If I gave in, they'd all be lost, and I couldn't let that happen. I took a shaky breath, tears streaming down my face. I loved Caleb, I whispered, and I let my guilt destroy me, but I won't let it destroy anyone else. I lifted the bundle in my hands. My voice cracked, but I spoke the words of the banishment ritual I'd found in the old town records. The sage caught fire easily, the flame small but fierce. The scent of smoke and salt filled the air. The figure shrieked, its form writhing, the smile melting into a snarl of fury. "You can't banish me!" it roared. "I am you!" "No," I said, my voice steadier now. "You're just my fear, and I'm done being afraid." I threw the burning sage at its feet. The flames flared, a blinding light cutting through the mist. The shadow screamed, its form twisting, unraveling into streams of black smoke that dissolved into the air. The clearing grew silent. The cold faded. I collapsed to the ground, sobbing. The ache was still there, the grief still raw, but the whispers were gone. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. The sun was setting as I walked back through the forest, the light filtering gently through the trees. The clinic came into view, its windows glowing softly. The weight in my chest was lighter, a burden finally shared with the world instead of hidden away. I paused at the edge of the woods and looked up at the sky. "I miss you, Caleb," I whispered, "but I have to keep going." And for the first time, I felt like I could. The air smelled of wet leaves and damp wood as I stepped out of my car onto the gravel parking lot of Willow Creek Elementary. A dense fog rolled across the cracked pavement, curling around my ankles like it wanted to pull me into the earth. The school building stood ahead, old, 2 stories tall, its brick facade stained with decades of rain. The windows were dark, reflective. They reminded me of eyes that didn't want to meet mine. I tugged my coat tighter and adjusted the strap of my worn leather bag. A fresh start, I reminded myself. This was supposed to be a new chapter, a break from the chaos I'd left behind in Boston. No more city noise, no more personal failures staring me down every day. Just a quiet village, a job teaching history to 4th graders, and maybe, finally, some peace. The front doors creaked as I pushed them open, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. Inside, the school smelled of old paper, disinfectant, and something else. Something stale, like air that hadn't been stirred in years. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, the wooden floors groaning beneath my weight. "Mr. Harris?" a voice called out from down the hall. I turned to see a woman approaching. She was small, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a cardigan that seemed one size too big. Mrs. Whitlock, the principal. Her smile was thin, polite, but her eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. Hesitation, maybe, or weariness. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was cold. "We're glad to have you here." "Thank you," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'm glad to be here." Her gaze lingered on me a second too long, like she was sizing me up. Then she nodded and turned, motioning for me to follow. As we walked, she gave me a clipped tour of the building. The classrooms were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The walls were lined with old, faded posters about kindness and teamwork, the edges curling like they wanted to escape. "This will be your classroom," Mrs. Whitlock said, stopping at the door to room 7. The plaque was tarnished, the number barely legible. "4th grade. They're good kids, but—" She paused, her mouth tightening. "Well, you'll see." I frowned. "Is there something I should know?" Her lips twitched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just the usual small-town quirks. Before I could ask more, she handed me a set of keys and left me standing there. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing rows of old wooden desks. Sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, casting slanted shadows across the floor. The air was colder in here, as though the room had been empty for too long. I set my bag on the desk at the front of the room, my fingers brushing over scratches and nicks carved into the wood by decades of restless students. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, trying to center myself. A muffled sound broke the silence, faint singing, drifting in through the open window. I turned my head sharply. Out on the playground, a group of children stood in a tight circle, their heads bowed together. Their voices floated up to me, thin and off-key. Round and round the jester goes. Where he stops, no one knows. The tune was simple, but there was something unsettling about it. The way they sang it, slow and deliberate, sent a chill up my spine. I shook it off. Kids have always had strange games. Odd little songs passed down through generations. It was probably nothing. But as I watched them, I noticed something strange. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, like they weren't really there. A shiver crept through me. I blinked, and in that split second, the song stopped. The children scattered across the playground, laughing and yelling as if nothing had happened. The chill lingered, though. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the feeling. It was probably just my imagination. Probably. The unsettling melody haunted me for the rest of the day, even as I went through my lessons, introduced myself, and tried to engage the kids in class discussions. It played at the edges of my mind, like a faint radio static I couldn't quite tune out. The children were polite, obedient even, but something was missing. Their responses to my questions were clipped, mechanical. Their eyes seemed distant, like they were half here, half somewhere else. I wondered if this was what Mrs. Whitlock had meant by quirks. When the final bell rang, they filed out in eerie silence, backpacks swaying as they shuffled toward the door. I sighed, letting the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time that day. I stayed behind to organize my desk, trying to shake the strange sense of dread. As I gathered up the papers, a faint whisper floated through the open window. Round and round the jester goes. Where he stops, no one knows. The pencil slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the floor. I rose slowly and walked to the window, my heartbeat quickening. Outside, the playground was nearly empty. Only a single child stood near the swings, her back to me, the hem of her faded blue dress fluttering in the breeze. It was Emily Carter, one of my quieter students, with dark curls that framed her pale face. She swayed gently, humming the tune to herself, her eyes fixed on something distant. Her lips moved in time with the song, but there was no joy in it, just a hollow, mechanical rhythm. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. "Emily!" I called out. She didn't respond. Her body continued to sway, her voice rising just above the whisper of the wind. I gripped the windowsill tighter. "Emily!" I shouted louder this time. Her head jerked up. She blinked as if waking from a dream and turned slowly toward me. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, she broke into a run, dashing across the playground toward the school gates. The wind seemed to carry the last echo of her song, chilling me to the bone. I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, my feet crunching on the gravel as I chased after her. By the time I reached the gates, she had vanished around the corner, swallowed by the thickening fog. I looked down the empty street, my breath clouding in the cold air. Nothing, no sign of her. My gut twisted with unease. I lingered there a moment longer, listening to the silence, before heading back inside. The halls were empty now, the late afternoon light casting long shadows that made everything feel stretched and distorted. That evening, I couldn't shake the image of Emily standing alone by the swings. Her vacant eyes, the way she sang that haunting tune, it gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. I sat at the small kitchen table in my rented house, papers spread out before me, but the words blurred together. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, every second a sharp reminder that something was wrong in Willow Creek. I drummed my fingers on the table, the rhythm matching the cadence of the song. The more I thought about it, the more the words looped through my mind. Round and round the jester goes. A sharp knock at the door startled me. My heart skipped a beat. I pushed the chair back and crossed the small room, hesitating before opening the door. It was Mrs. Whitlock. Her face was drawn, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She clutched a folder against her chest. "Mr. Harris," she said softly, "may I come in?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "Is everything all right?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked in and sat at the edge of one of the chairs, her back straight and tense. I closed the door and joined her at the table. "I heard you were looking for Emily after school," she began. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Did you find her?" I shook my head. "She ran off before I could catch up to her. Is she okay?" Mrs. Whitlock's fingers tightened around the folder. Her parents reported her missing an hour ago. The room felt colder suddenly. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each second dragging like an anchor. "Missing?" The word came out hoarse. "She's not the first," Mrs. Whitlock said, her eyes glistening. "Over the years, children have disappeared. Sometimes we find them. Sometimes we don't." A chill prickled at the back of my neck. "What are you saying?" She slid the folder across the table. I opened it, my eyes falling on yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photos, and reports that spanned decades. Each one told the same story. Children who vanished, all of them from Willow Creek. The pattern was impossible to ignore. In one photo, a group of children stood in a circle, their faces blurred with age. Scrawled in ink at the bottom were the words, "Round and round the jester goes." I looked up at Mrs. Whitlock, dread coiling tight in my gut. "Why are they singing that song?" I asked. Her voice trembled. "Because it calls to him." "Who?" She swallowed hard. The jester. His name was Jasper, and he's been waiting a long time. Mrs. Whitlock's words hung in the air, suffocating and impossible to grasp. The jester. My mind spun, trying to make sense of it. "Who is Jasper?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. Her fingers twisted the edge of her cardigan, eyes fixed on the table as if afraid to look up. Jasper was a performer, a traveling jester who came to Willow Creek decades ago. He entertained at town fairs and school events. She paused, her voice tightening. But something happened. Something terrible. I leaned forward. "What happened?" She looked at me then, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "He was accused of something he didn't do. The townsfolk turned on him. He was humiliated, beaten, and driven into the woods. He never came back." I swallowed hard, dread seeping into every inch of my body. "They killed him?" Mrs. Whitlock nodded. "They didn't find his body for days. When they did, his face was frozen in a grin, the same grin he always wore when he performed. But his eyes, they say his eyes were open, staring, like he was waiting for someone to find him." A shiver crawled down my spine. "And the song?" "It started after his death," she whispered. "Children sang it, not knowing where they learned it. And then the disappearances began." I sat back, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The song wasn't just a rhyme. It was a summons, an invocation. "He's taking them," I said, my voice cracking. "Jasper's spirit is taking the children." Mrs. Whitlock's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, and we've been powerless to stop it." A cold anger bubbled up inside me. "Why didn't anyone warn me? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Her shoulders sagged. "We hoped it would stop. We hoped that if we ignored it, it would fade away. But it never does." I clenched my fists. The thought of Emily, lost in those woods, maybe scared, maybe worse, it made my blood boil. I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. "What can we do?" I asked, desperation sharpening my words. "How do we stop this?" She took a shaky breath. "The only way to confront Jasper is to call him. The song summons him, but whoever sings it willingly must be prepared to face him. No one has ever dared." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of her words pressing down on me. I thought of Emily, her vacant eyes, her small body swaying to that haunting tune. I couldn't let another child vanish. I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. "I'll do it," I said, the decision crystallizing in my chest like ice. "I'll call him." Mrs. Whitlock's eyes widened. "You can't. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," I said. "If there's a chance to save Emily, to save all of them, I have to try." She looked at me for a long moment, her face etched with fear and something else. Hope, maybe. Finally, she nodded. "If you're going to do this, you need to know where it started," she said. "The old fairground. That's where he was last seen." A chill settled in my bones. I knew the place. A clearing at the edge of the forest, abandoned for years. The trees loomed there like silent sentinels, and the air always seemed colder, heavier. "Be careful, Mr. Harris," Mrs. Whitlock whispered. "Jasper's anger has festered for a long time. He won't let go easily." That night the sky was a heavy blanket of clouds, blotting out the moon. The wind whispered through the trees as I parked my car at the edge of the woods. The path to the fairground was overgrown, the brambles clawing at my legs as I walked. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it barely pushed back the shadows. The deeper I went, the colder it became. My breath came out in white puffs, and the silence pressed in around me. When I reached the clearing, the remnants of the old fairground lay before me. A crumbling stage, the tattered remains of banners fluttering like ghostly fingers. The air felt thick, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel in every nerve. I took a deep breath, my throat tight. This was it. I closed my eyes and began to sing. "Round and round the jester goes. Where he stops no one knows." The words trembled on my lips, the melody chilling me to my core. The air around me grew colder, the wind stilling. I felt a pressure, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I opened my eyes. He was there. Jasper stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure half shadow, half solid. His face was painted white, the grin stretched wide and grotesque. His eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent light, fixed on me. "Why have you called me?" he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping across the ground. My mouth went dry, but I forced myself to speak. "I want the children back." His grin faltered, his eyes narrowing. "They are mine now. They sang my song. They called me. They didn't know what they were doing," I said, my voice shaking. "They're innocent." "Innocent?" His laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. "There is no innocence in this place." "Please," I said, "they're just children. They don't deserve this." He took a step closer, his form shimmering like heat off asphalt. And what do I deserve? The pain in his voice cut through me. For a moment, I saw the man he once was, a performer who just wanted to make people laugh, betrayed by the very people he entertained. You deserve justice, I said quietly. But hurting these children won't give you that. His eyes flickered, the glow dimming for a heartbeat. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Justice, he whispered. After all this time, he took another step forward, his form beginning to dissolve. Bring them back, I said, my voice firm. Let them go. Jasper's eyes met mine, and for a second I saw something else in them. Regret, sorrow. Then he nodded. The wind rushed through the clearing and he vanished, his whisper lingering in the air. It is done. The cold dissipated, leaving behind a stillness that felt fragile, like glass on the edge of breaking. The clearing was empty again, just me and the whispers of the wind. My legs felt ready to collapse, but I forced myself to stay standing, scanning the shadows where Jasper had vanished. Had it worked? A rustling sound came from behind me. My heart clenched and I spun around, half expecting to see that twisted grin once more. Instead, a small figure stumbled out of the darkness. Emily. Her dark curls were tangled, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyes, wide and fearful, met mine. Emily! Relief surged through me, so strong it almost brought me to my knees. I rushed forward and knelt down, gripping her shoulders gently. Are you okay? She blinked at me, her lips trembling. I was lost, she whispered. It was dark. I couldn't find my way out. It's okay, I said, my voice cracking. You're safe now. I've got you. She clung to me, her small hands digging into my coat. I looked over her shoulder into the woods, half expecting to see more children stumbling out. But the shadows stayed still, the darkness holding its breath. Where are the others? I asked, a cold dread settling in my gut. Emily pulled back just enough to look at me. Her eyes glistened with tears. They're still there, she said softly. He's keeping them. I felt my stomach drop. But I thought... My voice trailed off. I thought he let them go. She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. He wants to, but he's scared. He doesn't know how to let go. The weight of her words crushed me. Jasper's pain, his anger. It was all still there, festering like an open wound. He wanted to release them, but his bitterness kept them trapped. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. Emily, can you find your way back to the edge of the woods? She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. I think so. Good. I squeezed her hand. Go straight to Mrs. Whitlock. Tell her to call the sheriff and have them come here. Her eyes widened with fear. What about you? I have to go back, I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. I have to help Jasper. She searched my face, her lower lip trembling. After a moment, she nodded and turned, running through the trees. Her small figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the heavy silence. I took a shaky breath. The cold had returned, seeping into my bones. I turned back toward the clearing and stepped into the darkness once more. The fairground ruins looked even more desolate now. The broken stage, the torn banners fluttering like ghosts. Everything felt steeped in sorrow. The air was thick, charged with an unseen presence. I swallowed hard and called out, Jasper! The word echoed, swallowed by the night. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the wind stilled, and he was there. Jasper's form flickered between solid and shadow, his painted grin frozen on his face. His eyes glowed faintly, filled with a mix of suspicion and pain. You came back, he said, his voice low and cracked. Yes, I replied. I want to help you. He laughed, a brittle sound that sent shivers down my spine. Help me? No one helped me when I needed it. I know, I said quietly. They failed you. They hurt you. And you've been hurting ever since. His eyes narrowed, the glow intensifying. And now they suffer, just like I did. I took a step closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The children didn't hurt you, Jasper. They didn't even know you. They're innocent, just like you were. His form wavered, the edges of his body blurring. They called me, he whispered. They sang my song. They didn't know what it meant, I said, but now we do, and we can make it right. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something beyond the rage. A flicker of uncertainty, of longing. Your story was buried, I continued, but it doesn't have to be. We can remember you, the real you, not just the jester, but the man you were before they took everything away. He stared at me, his expression unreadable. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around us. Remember me? He repeated, his voice barely audible. Yes, I said. We'll tell your story. We'll give you the justice you deserve. The glow in his eyes dimmed. His shoulders sagged, the tension draining from his form. The grin faded from his face, leaving only a hollow sadness. "I just wanted to be seen," he whispered, "to matter." "You do matter," I said, my voice breaking. A tear, black and thick like ink, rolled down his cheek. His form began to dissolve, wisps of shadow drifting away on the wind. "Thank you," he murmured, and his voice was soft, almost peaceful. The wind roared through the clearing, and then he was gone. The cold lifted, the air clear and still. I turned, my heart pounding, just as the rustling began again. From the shadows, small figures stepped into the light. Children, blinking and confused, their faces pale but alive. They were back. As the children emerged from the shadows, my chest tightened with relief and fear all at once. There were 5 of them, small, fragile figures stepping hesitantly into the clearing. Their eyes, wide and glassy, blinked against the moonlight as if waking from a long nightmare. I recognized each of them: Emily, Sam, Chloe, and 2 others I hadn't seen before, but whose faces matched the faded photos from the school archives. They were back, alive. I forced my legs to move, stumbling toward them. "It's okay," I said, my voice cracking. "You're safe now." Emily was the first to react. She broke into a run, crashing into me and burying her face in my coat. I held her tightly, feeling her small frame tremble. The other children followed, huddling close, their cold fingers gripping my sleeves, my hands, anything they could hold on to. "Where are we?" Sam whispered, his voice hoarse. "You're in the woods near the old fairground," I said softly. "But you're going home now, I promise." The wind whispered through the trees, and I felt the lingering chill of Jasper's presence, like a memory that refused to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, still waiting to be sure I kept my promise to remember him. I took a shaky breath. "Come on, let's get out of here." We walked back through the woods, the children clinging to me, their footsteps shuffling through the dead leaves. The darkness felt less oppressive now, as if the forest itself had exhaled. The weight that had pressed down on everything was gone, lifted with Jasper's release. Up ahead, a dim glow marked the end of the trail, the school parking lot. I saw the flashing lights of police cruisers and the distant forms of adults, parents, officers, and Mrs. Whitlock, waiting anxiously. As we stepped out of the woods, the air filled with shouts of relief. Mothers and fathers rushed forward, gathering their children in trembling arms. Tears flowed freely, mingling with words of disbelief and gratitude. The weight in my chest eased slightly as I watched the reunions unfold. Mrs. Whitlock stood at the edge of the lot, her hands clutched together. When her eyes met mine, they glistened with unshed tears. She walked toward me, her steps hesitant. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought them back." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Harris." Her voice trembled. "We owe you more than we can ever repay." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "It's not over, not really. The town, they need to know the truth. They need to remember." She looked away, shame flickering across her face. "It won't be easy." "No," I agreed. "But it's the only way to stop this from happening again." She took a deep breath and nodded. "Then we'll make sure they remember. Jasper deserves that much." The following days passed in a blur. The news of the children's return spread quickly, rippling through Willow Creek like a shockwave. The story of the missing kids, of the strange song and the haunted fairground, could no longer be buried under whispers and denial. I watched from the sidelines as the townspeople gathered in the school auditorium, their faces pale and drawn. Mrs. Whitlock stood at the podium, her voice steady as she recounted the forgotten tale of Jasper the Jester, the man who had been wronged, betrayed, and erased from memory. The guilt in the room was palpable, a heavy fog that no one could escape. Photos of Jasper were displayed on the projector screen, his painted smile, his bright eyes. They weren't the eyes of a monster, but of a man who once loved to make people laugh. When the presentation ended, a silence filled the room, deeper than any I had felt before. Then, one by one, people began to rise, heads bowed in acknowledgement of the truth they had hidden for so long. It was a start. One evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of crimson and violet, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods near the old fairground. The air was still, the trees casting long shadows across the ground. In my hand, I held a small bouquet of wildflowers, bright yellows and whites, the kind that grew in the forgotten places. I walked to the clearing, my footsteps light on the mossy ground. The ruins of the fairground looked softer now, less haunted. I knelt by the spot where I'd last seen Jasper. "Thank you," I whispered. "We remember you now." I laid the flowers down and stood there for a moment, the breeze stirring my hair, the forest alive with the quiet hum of night. For the first time since I arrived in Willow Creek, the air felt truly clear. As I turned to leave, a soft sound drifted through the clearing, faint, almost imagined, the echo of a laugh, warm and gentle. I smiled and walked back to the light. The days in Willow Creek slowly returned to a semblance of normality, but the air still held a whisper of unease. The children were safe, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The town had opened a door to its buried past, and some shadows refused to be fully erased. At the school, things were different now. The children's eyes were brighter, their voices louder, more natural. They laughed at recess, chased each other through the playground, and scribbled doodles in the margins of their notebooks. The rigid silence that had gripped them was gone, but even in the lightness, there were still scars. Emily and Sam flinched at sudden noises, their eyes darting to the shadows. Some wounds didn't heal overnight. I tried to focus on teaching, but my mind kept drifting. The old fairground, Jasper's hollow grin, the whisper of his laugh that I'd heard on the wind. His story had been acknowledged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for the town to truly make amends. One afternoon, as the final bell rang and the children filed out, Mrs. Whitlock appeared at my classroom door. Her face was drawn, lines of exhaustion carved around her eyes. "Mr. Harris," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" I nodded, setting down my stack of papers. "Of course." We walked together down the empty hallway, the sun casting long, golden beams through the dusty windows. The quiet was no longer oppressive, but it still felt fragile, as if one wrong step could shatter it. She led me to her office and closed the door behind us. The familiar scent of old books and stale coffee filled the small room. Mrs. Whitlock sank into her chair and gestured for me to sit. "There's something I need to show you," she said, her voice hesitant. From a drawer, she pulled out an old, leather-bound ledger. The edges were worn, the spine cracked with age. She set it carefully on the desk and opened it to a yellowed page. Her finger traced a line of faded ink. "This is a record from 1952, she said. "It lists all the children who attended Willow Creek Elementary that year. Look at the bottom." I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the list of names. Most were familiar, the ancestors of the students I taught now. But at the bottom, a name stood out. Jasper Whitlock. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at her, confusion and realization dawning all at once. "Jasper was—" I couldn't finish the sentence. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "He was my uncle." A wave of cold swept through me. The connection was right there, woven into the fabric of the town's history. Jasper wasn't just a forgotten performer. He was part of Mrs. Whitlock's own family. "My family never spoke of him," she continued, her voice shaking. "The shame was too great. After what happened, they buried his name, his memory, everything. I didn't even know the full story until recently." I swallowed hard, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I need to make it right," she said. "I've spent my life upholding this school, this town, but I ignored the rot beneath it. I can't do that anymore." I nodded, the resolve in her voice giving me a flicker of hope. "What do you want to do?" She took a deep breath. "We're going to hold a memorial. For Jasper, for the children who disappeared. The town needs to face what it did and finally honor the truth." Her words settled over me like a balm. It was the right thing, the only thing that could bring true peace. The day of the memorial arrived with a sky full of gray clouds, a somber backdrop fitting for the occasion. The entire town gathered at the old fairground, the place where everything had begun, and where it would, hopefully, find closure. A small platform had been set up, adorned with wildflowers and old photos of Jasper. Faces that had once scorned his memory now looked on with solemn respect. Mrs. Whitlock stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges. She cleared her throat and the crowd quieted. "We are here today," she began, her voice steady, "to acknowledge a part of our past that we've tried for too long to forget. My uncle, Jasper Whitlock, was wronged by this town. He was betrayed, and his memory was buried along with the truth of what happened to him." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd, but no one spoke. "We can't change the past," she continued, "but we can choose to remember. We can choose to make amends, and we can choose to ensure that no one is ever forgotten again." She stepped back, and I felt a shift in the air, a lifting of something heavy and ancient. The crowd began to move forward one by one, laying flowers at the foot of the platform, whispering apologies, prayers, and silent promises. I stood off to the side, watching the faces of the townspeople. For the first time, I saw something other than fear or denial. I saw acceptance, healing. A breeze stirred through the clearing, and for a moment, I thought I heard that faint, familiar laugh. Not the twisted, bitter sound I remembered, but a gentle, contented chuckle. I closed my eyes and smiled. Jasper was finally at peace.